I have spent more than 100 hours researching the One Piece manga, and I have managed to solve the biggest mystery of Davy Jones and Joy Boy. The truth is that making this video has taken me a lot of time. As I said, I have spent more than 100 hours in total researching the manga, reading the chapters, rereading, searching in various languages, various translations, to find the most suitable words for the original Japanese translation. And I have done all this with the sole intention of finding the clues that Oda has left us in the manga. Because obviously everything we are gonna talk about Joy Boy, about Davy D. Jones, of Emu, of the Ancient Kingdom, of the Void Century, all these things are things we have already seen in the manga. They are things Oda has already hinted at. They are things Oda has wanted in one way or another to give us those little clues, those little foreshadows he loves to give us, but without revealing the complete story. That is, doing the typical thing Oda does, which is giving you certain clues that you can then connect to trace a story that will ultimately be the closest to the truth that will be revealed in future chapters. Obviously, apart from the things we are going to discuss that are in the manga, I will also comment a bit on speculation, theory, and that is the moment when I connect the dots. That is to say, I will be commenting on things that are 100% confirmed, things that the author has placed in the manga from the latest chapters, and not so recent chapters, because there are things from more than 200 chapters ago, and I will tell you my interpretation of how I connect these points. Because obviously, like every theory video, there are two parts. The part with important data that needs to be checked, reviewed, and considered, and then there's the theory part, which is purely speculation. And this is where you can also join in through the comments. To say that this video is going to be quite long, and I know that many of you use it as background while you go to sleep, while you're on your way to work, while you're hanging clothes, while you're doing household chores, and many other things. And as always, I love it when you leave in the comments what you're doing while listening to this video in the background, as it makes me very curious and you tell me more and more interesting things each time. So if you've put it on to go to sleep, good night, and if you've put it on while eating, enjoy your meal. Normally, people only use it for this. Also, I want to say that obviously this kind of video takes a lot of work, so a big like, a subscription, and hitting the hype button if it appears would help a lot, as it's supposed to make the video get recommended more. Now let's start directly with the video. Let's begin with the theory, and I will divide it into a couple of parts. As I said, first we will have to review what happened in the last chapters, because certain information has been given that is very important, things we need to keep in mind, and I will also talk to you about how in the real world there are certain things that Oda has been able to portray in the work, and you will see some similarities that are too curious to think it's something random. And obviously Oda once again has drawn from the real world to depict things in the world of One Piece. But well, I don't want to get ahead of myself, so let's take it step by step. First thing I want to mention is that the basis of this theory is from chapter 1164 of the One Piece manga, a chapter in which many things happen. Ignoring the Domi reversey to Xebec, we need to focus on a conversation that Xebec has with Emu, where they talk about Joy Boy, Davy Jones, they talk about the King of the World, about what happened a long time ago. And despite Oda continuing his habit of not wanting to reveal information to us 100%, it is true that he has given us certain clues and enough information to connect it with things from, as I said, more than 200 chapters ago, and start to trace a thread that will allow us to solve everything. The first thing I will talk about is the Davy clan. In this flashback, it has been revealed by Rox D. Xebec that his name is not Rox D. Xebec, but rather Davy D. Xebec introducing a new surname, introducing a new clan as he calls it, and this changes things a lot since he says he is a descendant of Davy Jones, whose real name was Davy D. Jones, implying that they are obviously from the D clan, from the Davy clan. And this also implies that Xebec's son, who is Marshall D. Teach not be Marshall D. Teach, but rather Davy D. Teach, making this will, this surname, continue to be passed down over the years, something that today we know is present with Teach being one of the leading figures in piracy worldwide, honoring what his father was in his time. Later in the video, we will discuss exactly who or what Davy D. Jones is. Let's talk about the real-world mythology that exists about him and review all the information we have about this character in One Piece. But as I said, we will do this later, because right now the only important thing is to remember and consider the topic of the Davy clan. Here I want to make a small parenthesis, and that is when this was revealed, I mentioned at the time that perhaps we should not rule out the possibility of the D and Monkey D. Luffy or Jaguar D. Saul, the very famous D would mean Davy. And some might think this makes no sense, because why would it be called Davy D? Jones if the D means Davy? Well, this is something I mentioned at the time, and maybe I was called a bit crazy, but today it has gained a lot of traction. And what I personally understand is that over these 800 years that we know the Void Century and all the other things have passed, the information could have been misinterpreted or corrupted. And let's suppose that the word Davy was meant to be erased from history by the world government and they started calling it the D, but the same heirs of the Davy clan knew that the word Davy was something very important and that it came from Davy Jones. So perhaps with the manipulation of the information itself and the introduction of the letter D in many families, they interpreted that if they also came from that past, then maybe Davy Jones had a D, without thinking that Davy was the same D just hidden. And this is something I see Oda very capable of doing. It's not what I'm going to focus on in the theory, but I do think it's important to mention it because what better way to hide the D than by putting it right in front of us? I mean, the logical part tells you it's not Davy, because obviously why would it have that D? And this would be a very good idea from Oda to say, hey, I told you, but you didn't want to see it, and obviously you weren't going to think about it because I was practically discarding it for you. When if you think about it with a bit of quote-unquote logic, it could be that this information over 800 years has been corrupted, moved, and distorted, so that in this way the letter D becomes, well, Davy. As I said, I don't want to get too deep into this because it's not that relevant to the theory, but I do think it's important to mention it, and we're going to talk about the Davy clan. When we talk about the Davy clan as of today, we only know of 3 banners that were very important and still are today. The first is Davy D. Jones, who, as I said, we'll discuss all the information later, but we know he is a very important pirate in the history of the One Piece world. Then we have Davy D. Xebec, who was another very important pirate, and here we see his end in God Valley, possessed by Emu, and also trying to create a kind of void around him, erasing his name from history. And we have Davy D. Teach, who is the last standard bearer of this surname, of this clan, and who we assume will reach the end of One Piece and will have some kind of fight against Emu or some kind of war, or will unleash something. You know my theory, I believe that Emu will perish at the hands of Teach, and that it will be Teach, finally, the Davy who fulfills this dream that has been talked about a lot. And I think it's important to mention it here. We have to go to the moment when Rox appears in front of Emu in the flower chamber and tells him that he is a big fan of Davy Jones and says he will return to finish him off. He sends him a message, he sends him a threat, he tells him he will return and accompanies it with the mention of Davy Jones, which at first might seem like something just put there for the sake of it, and later we see it gains much importance because Xebec reveals that he is a descendant of Davy Jones himself. And as I say, once we reach this point, we might assume there's nothing more, nothing important, but it seems to me that we're overlooking something, and it's when Emu appears in front of Xebec in God Valley, he tells him that he will defeat him, and that a promise must be fulfilled. We see how he introduces the terms promise and fulfilled. This is something we have seen for a long time in One Piece. Let's remember, for example, Joy Boy's promise to the first Fishman princess, which he couldn't fulfill and ended up in the apology letter on the poneglyph we also found on Fishman Island. And then later, when Emu applies the Domi Reversi on Xebec, we see how Emu says to end this right now, to end Davy's dream. And this, which at first seemed like just random words, becomes very important because Emu uses it to his advantage and performs the Domi Reversi with the sole objective of ending the bloodline of the Davy family, ending his wife Eris, and ending his son Teach, since the others had suffered the effect of the Domi Reversi and had already been taken out of the way by Rox. Then, Emu himself, who knows about Davy Jones, makes us understand that Davy's dream is something that goes beyond. It's like a kind of will. It's something important, and we are going to see that perhaps this has been in the work for a very long time, maybe 15 years. And we have to go back to the island of Jaya where we find Marshal D. Teach for the first time. We meet this character who has some words, who has a speech that made a big impact, and he says that people's dreams never die. At first we might think he was referring to a dream he had, a dream he might have inherited from someone close, but it seems not. And this dream that Davy D. Teach talks about, the descendant of Davy D. Xebec and descendant of Davy D. Jones, it is Davy's dream, and that dream, that will, has been passed down from generation to generation until now this person, Marshall D. Teach, Davy D. Teach, has it and knows he wants to fulfill it, that he is going to fulfill it. Let's also remember that when the name was revealed in the conversation between Rox and Harold, Xebec revealed that he told his son to trust the Davy clan, which were very important words, because obviously if he tells him to trust the Davy clan, and now they talk about Davy's dream, and we take into account Xebec's own words when he encountered Emu in the flower chamber, where he told him he would finish him, then there is a dream to fulfill. And what is that dream? Well, now we can go to this. As I said, we are still in chapter 1164, and we see that Emu starts applying the Domi Reversi to Xebec, and while Xebec resists the effect of the Domi Reversi as much as he can, we see that they have a brief conversation, and Xebec says to Emu right to his face, Davy D. Jones, that is the name of the ancient king of the world. Very important this, because he is using the term king of the world. Really, it is important. To which Emu responds, "Shut up, that guy was never a king, not even for a moment. You know nothing about the grudge between Davy and Moo." To which Xebec responds that he shouldn't be intimidated by a simple name like Davy. And he continues saying, "You were always afraid, right? Afraid that Davy's will would be inherited and that one day he would come to fulfill his promise, returning to the promise he made to him in the Chamber of Flowers, that he would end him." And to finish, he says, "Which of the two scares you more, Davy Jones or Joy Boy?" First of all, the most important thing here is that it confirms they are two different people, but then Emu continues speaking and says, "Stop dreaming, those guys will never appear again, if only you would disappear." And this is truly crazy, because even though it seems like it doesn't go further and doesn't address anything important, it has given us enough information to trace different things and different patterns that are very interesting. The first thing, as I say, is the matter of Davy Jones's promise and dream, which I think is quite easy to know. I think it's quite intuitive, and I think Oda has made it quite clear to us. And that is, Davy Jones's dream is to overthrow the king of the world and place himself as the king of the world. And I think this is quite easy to understand. Everything we saw in the flashback of Rox and Xebec was aimed at this. He said he needed 2 fruits. He said he had a plan that was very well laid out for this. He even threatened Emu in the Chamber of Flowers. Even when he faced him in God Valley, he told him he was going to finish him, and also said that a promise had to be fulfilled. I think this is quite simply reflected in the manga, and I think it's something that at first you might not think about, but when you analyze it a bit, you say, hey, I think they've served it to me on a silver platter. I think it's quite easy to understand. So while the first thing is that we are already clear that the promise, the objective, the will that Davy Jones has is to overthrow the king of the world and make himself the king of the world, well, again. And I say again because Xebec confirms that Davy Jones was the former king of the world. But we will get to this now. The important thing about all this is that we already know at least the goal, aim, or dream of Teach. We know that he is preparing something, and we know that he is going directly after Emu. This character, who perhaps has gone a bit unnoticed, I have already mentioned in the latest videos that despite Oda wanting to make us see that he is a bit missing and not in the main spotlight, is a character that truly should be greatly feared. The first thing is that he is a character with a huge army of people with devil fruits. He has a very powerful crew. As of today, he possesses the location of 3 road poneglyphs that he stole from Trafalgar Law. He has kidnapped the marine hero, Garp. He has Pudding, who might be able to read the road poneglyphs. And also, and not less important, he possesses the memory fruit, which at first seems like it won't be very useful, but in my opinion, it could be used to extract Garp's memories and see exactly what we are seeing in this flashback, to understand who Emu is, what Emu is, see his father, hear his father's last words, and have all the information he lacks if he is missing anything. Then it also has Saturn's face, which some might think is not very useful since Saturn is dead, but I think it's even more serious because most people don't know that Saturn is dead. This hasn't been revealed to the world. We haven't seen it in the news. It's something that happened relatively recently. So having Saturn's face to infiltrate Mary Joy's or something like that could be a huge problem. And going back to Garp, let's remember that his goal was to make Hachinosu a country to be able to go to the Reverie. And obviously he wants to go to the Reverie to do something dangerous. What? Well, to go after Emu. And if all this were not enough, he will also have the location of 2 ancient weapons. And you might think, why is that? Well, let's remember that Katarina Devon and Van Augur took Caribou to Teach. And Caribou knows the locations of Shirahoshi, Poseidon on Fishman Island, and of Pluton in the land of Wano as well. Therefore, even though Oda has taken Teach off the screen and out of the main focus, it is something very important to keep in mind, and I think he will be a worthy successor to both Davy Jones and Davy and Xebec. But now that we more or less have the promise of Davy Jones and more or less have all this clear, let's go to the information given to us. And they tell us that Davy Jones is the former king of the world. But let's look again at Emu's reaction to these words. And Emu says, "Shut up. That guy was never a king. Not for a moment. You know nothing about the grudge that exists between Davy and Mu. This is important to me because I think it reveals several things. The first thing is that the original king of the world, the first one, was Davy Jones. He was the first. And then Emu somehow took that throne and became the king of the world. But the important thing is the words he mentions, and he says that he knows nothing about the grudge that exists between Davy and Mu. Here, I must say that the only doubt I have is whether he is referring to the Davy clan and the Mu clan, which is something I made up. The Mu clan, it hasn't been revealed. But considering that the Davy clan exists, perhaps he is not speaking about himself and is referring to the family, the Mu clan, and that they are two clans that have been in conflict for a long time, which is why he uses the word resentment between them. But if not, the simplest option is that there is resentment between Davy Jones and Emu. But why the word resentment? Why does he get indignant when he is told he was the king and Emu tells him that he was never a king, that Davy Jones was never a king, not even for a moment? What I take from this, in my opinion, is something very simple. And it makes me understand that, as I say, Davy Jones was the king of the world. He was the king. He was the person who ruled. But Emu, I understand, was perhaps a friend of Davy Jones. And at some point, this person, Davy Jones, did something that Emu didn't like. Did something that made him not consider him as king. And we will discuss this more later because there is truly a biblical story that could be somewhat related to this. And then I will let you speculate as you wish. But what I think is that when Davy Jones did something he didn't like, Emu somehow accumulated hatred and betrayed him, overthrew him from his position, and made himself king of the world because perhaps he was doing things that he didn't agree with. Maybe Davy Jones wasn't as bad as we think. Maybe he took being the king of the world a bit as a joke, a bit as a game or something like that. And maybe Emu thought that wasn't kingly, that perhaps the figure he worshipped, which was Davy Jones, wasn't as godlike, so to speak, and decided to take the position himself and show that he could be the king of the world. And this is what he has been trying to avoid for so long, that the promise of Davy Jones, that surely his last words would be the same as Xebec told him in the Chamber of Flowers, that he would return, that he would finish him, and that he couldn't stop him. Perhaps also speaking of the inherited will and instilling this fear in Emu, because we see that when he is mentioned, he becomes extremely nervous and then says that those two, both Davy Jones and Joy Boy, will not reappear. So with the word resentment introduced and Emu's reaction, the feeling I get is that somehow he betrayed the king of the world at the time and overthrew him. It's not that they were enemies from the beginning, but there is resentment because perhaps Emu felt betrayed and that's why he betrayed him. Let me explain. Perhaps Davy Jones did not take any physical action to betray Emu, but by doing certain actions that he did not consider kingly, that's why he denies that Davy Jones was the king. Emu decided to betray him, and somehow in his mind, he believed it was right because he was not a good king, because he did not act well, and he considered it a betrayal both to Emu himself and to the position of king of the world. And as a result of all this, as I say, Emu was put in place, and everything that followed came. At this point, it might seem like we have already discussed everything important, but no, we have much left. And it also mentions Joy Boy, which is important because it confirms both that Davy Jones and Joy Boy were two different people, and that, well, Joy Boy was not the king of the world. Some might say, hey, why wasn't Joy Boy the king of the world? Why do you say it with such certainty? Well, this is simple, and we have to go to the Egghead arc, where we saw Emmett appear, who was a friend of Joy Boy, likely a crew member, and Emmett did something many times during the arc, which was to apologize. He apologized to Joy Boy. Do you remember why he was apologizing? He apologized because he couldn't make him king, and here you might think that perhaps he was referring to not being king of the pirates, but no, he was referring to not being able to make him king of the world. Why do I say this? Because if we go to chapter 967 of the manga, where Roger finds the One Piece and becomes the king of the pirates, we see that this title is something Roger seems to obtain for the first time. It wasn't something that was up in the air like today, where we know that many people want to be the king of the pirates, but rather it was a kind of title that Roger somehow created. and I read the people's dialogues to you as they are. We see that a bunch of newspapers are falling where they say that Roger has obtained the One Piece, and we see that people say, Roger's pirates have done it. They have circled the world like no one has done before. Finally, we have the champion of the seas. He is the king of the sea. He is the king of the pirates. And then we have Roger's own reaction upon learning that he has been given that title. And we see Rayleigh, who is reading the newspaper in front of Roger, reading what it says, and he says, fame, wealth, power, the man who achieved it all, the king of the pirates, Gold Roger. And Roger says, it's Goldie. Roger, but that Pirate King thing doesn't sound bad at all. And then Roger's crew says that now they understand everything. They understand why the world government hides his name. But as we see, Roger says that the Pirate King thing doesn't sound bad, as if implying that it's a title he hadn't heard before, but it was given to him, as if saying, hey, well look, the Pirate King thing doesn't sound bad. Roger's reaction indicates that it is not a title that already existed and that he wanted to achieve, like saying, look, I am finally the king of the pirates, but rather it is a title that has been attributed to him. In fact, if we look throughout One Piece, when they talk about the Pirate King, they always relate it to Roger. They say, I want to be the king of the pirates like Roger, but they can't give you another example. That is to say, it is a title that was created with Roger, so in the Void Century, the title of King of the Pirates probably did not exist, or at least not in this way. Therefore, probably in the Void Century, this title did not properly exist, as I say, as a title, the title King of the Pirates. So, if the Pirate King didn't exist, the only king there was, as confirmed by chapter 1164, was the King of the World. So if Emmett apologized because he couldn't make Joy Boy the king, it was precisely the King of the World, implying that they lost the war as we saw in the mural and couldn't make him King of the World. And this war, which many of us would think was perhaps against Davy Jones, seems not to be the case, that this war was against Emu. So the order of events would be something like Davy Jones was the king of the world, Emu took that position, and then Joy Boy went to try to take this position as well, and finally they lost. Here it is important because perhaps it could now surprise us and outline a slightly different story, with something that I will later explain by talking about Davy Jones. The things we have seen of him in One Piece, real-world mythology, and other things. We might suppose in some way that Joy Boy and Davy Jones were perhaps friends, or got along well, or maybe did not get along badly at all. To think that Davy Jones was the king of the world, was betrayed and overthrown by Emu, and Joy Boy, upon learning of this and seeing that this person, Davy Jones, was no longer in charge and that a much worse person had taken over, went to try to avenge Davy Jones, faced Emu and lost by running, things we still don't know 100%. But then Emu, after Zebek's words, saying which of the two scares him more, if David Y. Jones or Joy Boy adds to stop dreaming that those guys will never appear again, and he leaves it hanging. This is very, very, very important because if we go to chapter 908 of the One Piece manga, right in the chapter where Emu appears in front of the 5 elders, we have a scene that is very important, and we see in the flower garden that Emu has some photos that are cut up and stabbed. And whose photos are these? The first is Shirahoshi's, which is pierced. And this is important because we saw that while Roger was leaving Fishman Island, the Sea Kings were talking and saying that finally the two kings would meet again, that it would take 10 years to be born and 15 to grow enough, referring to Shirahoshi. Also because they themselves define him as their king, and then we saw that Shirahoshi, being Poseidon, has the ability to control them. She is their queen, so to speak. This is the first thing, and obviously she is an extremely important figure for the Void Century, for the history and future of One Piece, and for Emu. And then there are 2 photos which are of Luffy and Teach. Initially, it was thought that since they were 2 very important people of the D-Plan, Emu had the photos there, but going back to chapter 1164, it is implied that this is not the case, and it is that Zebek somehow instills fear in Emu that those 2 will appear, and here they have the wills of both Joy Boy and Davy Jones. Also, Teach has a very, very similar appearance to Rocks. Imagine Emu's face when he realized that this person with the D, who had Zebek's face, was active again and knew he was coming back for him, that the will he thought was destroyed was not. Since remember that in this chapter 1164, Emu thinks that both Teach and Eris have died, but Kuma saved them. So with all this, we can have many things very clear. First of all the clues that Oda has left us, and all the indications of Emu's concern with the photos. Then the theme of dreams, the promise, and everything related to Davy Jones and his inherited will, which today resides in Teach. then also that Joy Boy could not become king, but it did not refer to King of the Pirates because that title did not exist, but rather King of the World, which at the time also was Davy Jones, and that probably with the word resentment in the middle was that Emu probably knew Davy Jones and perhaps was part of his crew, which I would really like, because if we look, Zebek's crew already betrayed him. Maybe Teach's crew will also bring a betrayal, and maybe that's a bit of the Davy family curse, that they will always have someone by their side who betrays them. They will always have an Emu by their side. But there is still much to discuss, because we are going to explain and comment on who Davy Jones is in the world of One Piece and who he is in the real world. And I am going to explain to you all the mythology of Davy Jones. I am going to tell you a story of biblical references that also refers to what Davy Jones later became and the origin of the name Davy Jones. And then you will see how all this relates very easily to One Piece, and I will even leave it to you so that you can make the connection. And it is quite clear that the canonical information we have about Davy Jones in One Piece is very little. That's why I will do my best to build mountains with the little bits of data we have. But as of today, with what we have, it is impossible to put together a complete story. So actually, the only reason it's even possible to discuss Davy Jones is because Davy Jones is a real-life pirate legend. That is, we can draw information from real life, since from the series, well, at the moment we don't have much. And I'm sure that most people who have seen One Piece have also seen Pirates of the Caribbean, and vice versa. I, for example, have not seen Pirates of the Caribbean, but I had to research to make this video. I should watch them? Let me know in the comments. As I was saying, Davy Jones is a very well-known name in popular culture, and it is logical to assume that although there will obviously be some differences, much of Davy Jones's story in One Piece will be based on existing mythology, just as Oda has done with other legendary characters. Exactly like the character of Loki, the giant prince, because if we look at him and compare him with the Loki from Norse mythology, at first glance, they are very different, but in the fundamental and most important aspects, they are essentially the same, while being, as I said, quite different at the same time. Anyway, I might be going on a bit, but I want us to think of Davy Jones with that mindset. This is how Oda usually works. The better you understand the legend that inspires a character, the better you will understand the character itself. So let's start directly with the story of Davy Jones in mythology. And it is much simpler than one might think, because unlike many characters from various mythologies that Oda has adapted in One Piece, Davy Jones himself does not have a very concrete story. Historically, Davy Jones is basically just a name associated with pirate life. In fact, when talking about Davy Jones, it almost always refers to Davy Jones's locker, which is a nautical euphemism for death at sea. In pirate tradition, Davy Jones is often depicted as a kind of ruler of the pirates' underworld. In many representations, he is literally portrayed as the demon of the sea. So if we base ourselves only on that, it seems we don't know much about Davy Jones, and the theory would have to end here. But actually, no, because there are two additional resources we can use to reconstruct the story of this character. The first would be the legend and mythology of Davy Jones, which has always intrigued people for a long time. It is natural that there are academic theories about what his real origin might be. Even if we do not know the exact truth, these theories are relevant to the discussion we are having. And the second thing is that sometimes the historical truth behind an inspiration for One Piece is not the most important thing. That's how myths and legends are. Perhaps there was some real event that originated them, but over time, they become stories told in different ways, with many creative liberties. That's why the character of Davy Jones in One Piece could very well end up having much in common with the popular fictional version of Davy Jones. For example, as I say, the one from Pirates of the Caribbean, besides the little we know in the manga, Oda is not exactly a purist of mythology. And I hate to break illusions, but in the original legends, Davy Jones was not a giant squid, nor did he sail on the Flying Dutchman. In fact, the Flying Dutchman was another separate pirate legend that Disney decided to mix with Davy Jones. And it certainly worked for them. Legends and myths tend to be that malleable. Well, here's a brief summary of the story of Davy Jones according to Disney in Pirates of the Caribbean. Originally, Davy Jones was simply a man, a pirate, and a sailor. The exact circumstances vary in the stories, but essentially Davy Jones fell in love with a beautiful and fickle sea goddess named Calypso. As proof of his love, he agreed to fulfill a task that the goddess assigned him, to guide the souls of those who perished at sea to their eternal rest. The idea is that Davy Jones could only return to reunite with Calypso on her island once every 10 years. He accepted that deal out of love, but he was deceived and betrayed. When he returned to the island after 10 years hoping to find her, Calypso was not there. It's curious because many think of Davy Jones as the devil of the sea, but in Pirates of the Caribbean, the real devil is Calypso. Davy made a deal with Calypso, who would be the equivalent of the devil in that story. And he did not get what he wanted. On the contrary, he was condemned to a rather horrible fate, doing something for all eternity that he really did not want to do. Due to this betrayal, Davy Jones summoned the first Pirate Brethren Court, a great alliance of pirates, and conspired with them to take control of the seas from the goddess Calypso. Ultimately, the Brotherhood managed to imprison Calypso by trapping her essence within the body of a mortal woman. Despite achieving revenge this way, Davy was still devastated by the love he had for her, so much so that due to the pain he felt, he tore out his heart with his own hands and locked it away in the famous dead man's chest. In practice, you can see it as Davy Jones removing his own soul. After that, he became an evil being, renounced his sacred duty of guiding souls in the afterlife, and instead began recruiting those who did not want to die into his crew, basically enslaving fearful sailors. Davy Jones took advantage of the fear of people who are afraid to die without achieving their goals, becoming something like a literal demon of the sea. Over time, the entire conflict of Pirates of the Caribbean revolves around the heart of Davy Jones. Whoever controls his heart controls the man, and this is where the story gains interesting depth. Look, Davy Jones was part of the pirate council that initially joined forces to defeat the sea goddess, because they saw her as the devil to conquer. But then Davy Jones became the devil, so the Pirate Brotherhood had to gather again and decided to release Calypso to help them fight against Davy Jones, now turned into a monster, and also against the Navy. There is something cyclical in all this that fits well with the world of One Piece. Essentially, whoever holds the power ends up becoming the devil of the story. First, the sea goddess Calypso was the villain, then it was Davy Jones, then it was the trading company, which was the Navy when it obtained Davy Jones's power, and then the pirates again when they released Calypso, making deals with the devil and ultimately becoming the devil themselves in each cycle. In other words, the devil keeps changing faces, but at each stage of the adventure, the Sea Warriors are fighting against some incarnation of evil. In the end, while everyone was fighting each other, pirates against pirates, pirates against the Navy, deep down, they were all fighting for the same thing, only each side had its own vision of what the true evil to defeat was. Summarizing the story of Davy Jones in Pirates of the Caribbean. Davy Jones had a love story. Davy Jones was betrayed. Davy Jones lost his soul by removing his heart. Davy Jones became a demon, and the way to free him from his curse in the end was to kill him. Davy Jones had to die to be free. Now then, we will later revisit some details of Pirates of the Caribbean that I haven't mentioned yet, because I believe Davy Jones's story in One Piece will share many of these key elements. But let's move on to what we know within the world of One Piece itself. The only real information we have been given about Davy Jones in the manga is told to us by Nico Robin during the Foxy Saga. Robin mentions that Davy Jones was a pirate from a very long time ago and that he was cursed by a demon, and honestly, just with that, it already sounds quite close to everything we just reviewed. But as I mentioned before, even though there isn't a real historical tale of Davy Jones in our world, there are investigations and theories about the origin of the name Davy Jones. It may not be the definitive truth, but it's the closest we can get to a historical basis for this legend, and it's relevant to discuss it. Specifically, I want to talk to you about the theory that the name Davy Jones actually comes from the biblical story of the prophet Jonah. And I'll say it right now, those who are into theories know that Oda has been greatly inspired by the Bible, so this already makes some sense, doesn't it? I will not go into all the details of the story of Jonah because not all are relevant. I prefer to give a summary of who Jonah was and why he is related to Davy Jones. The most characteristic thing about Jonah is that at first he refused to obey a direct order from God. In essence, Jonah fled from what God had commanded him to do. There are different interpretations of why he did it, but we can assume that Jonah was afraid to fulfill that divine mandate. The fact is that God had ordered Jonah to do something very specific, to go preach to a city full of wickedness to offer them salvation. And Jonah didn't like that idea one bit. He thought those wicked people didn't deserve to be saved. In fact, later in the story, when God actually forgives that city, Jonah gets very angry. Jonah did not want to save the wicked. Returning to the part where Jonah flees, Jonah boarded a ship to escape the assigned mission, and then God unleashed a great storm at sea to prevent him from fleeing. The sailors on the ship panicked, and Jonah, knowing he was the cause of the disaster, confessed to them that the storm was his fault for disobeying God. He even told them to throw him into the sea to calm the storm and save their lives. This shows that Jonah was willing to face the consequences of his actions. He himself offered as a sacrifice to appease divine wrath. Although more than genuine repentance, it seemed basically a kind of resignation. Basically, Jonah preferred to die rather than fulfill the order of God that he so detested. Then, in the midst of this furious storm, the sailors finally threw Jonah into the sea, but God had no intention of Jonah dying there. Instead, he sent a great fish, traditionally interpreted as a whale, which swallowed Jonah whole. Jonah remained alive inside the whale for 3 days and 3 nights. That time inside the belly of the cetacean was a kind of personal purgatory for Jonah. It served for him to reflect and pray, to think about what had happened and why he was wrong to disobey. A bit of sailor context. In the nautical culture of the past, it was considered that having a Jonah on board brought bad luck. Imagine the sailors are at sea and suddenly a terrible storm breaks out. They would look at each other searching for the jinx. Who is the Jonah on this ship? Who do we have to throw overboard? That is to say, Jonah became synonymous with a person who brings bad luck at sea. And all this fits quite well with the similarity between the name Jonas and Jones. It is believed that the term Davy Jones might have originated as a deformation or evolution of Jonas. On the other hand, Davy sounds similar to devil in some old sailor languages, so some think that Davy was a nickname given to certain spirits or entities, like saying the Devil Jones, which is where Davy Jones would come from. In the end, that's how language evolves. Someone says something to another, others like how it sounds, everyone starts repeating it, and in the end, no one remembers exactly where it came from. The other concrete part of the legend of Davy Jones is his famous locker, Davy Jones's locker. In sailor jargon, as we said, it's a euphemism for death at sea, but it doesn't refer to death itself, rather to a sort of final resting place beneath the waves. Notice that Davy Jones's locker is never exactly described as hell or the afterlife. It's more like a kind of purgatory, an intermediate place between life and death for those who die at sea. In Pirates of the Caribbean, in fact, Davy Jones's job was to guide souls to the afterlife. But first, those souls passed through Davy Jones's locker, a marine limbo before their final destination. This makes a perfect parallel with Jonah inside the whale. Jonah was in a state where he was neither dead nor alive, suspended in the darkness of the fish's belly. But why am I telling you all this? Well, because I believe that Jonah's story could be exactly the inspiration for ODA for the character of Davy Jones in One Piece, both his personality and certain key events in his life. Broadly speaking, Jonah was someone with a strong sense of morality, who nevertheless was filled with hatred towards the wicked. He wanted the wicked to suffer and be condemned, and it was very difficult for him to learn compassion. Jonah saw himself as a righteous man who wanted to save the innocent, but at the same time, he wished to punish the wicked mercilessly. Now, why am I so sure that Davy Jones in One Piece will be based on Jonah? Well, because knowing Jonah's story, we already have in One Piece a character whose story fits too well into that mold. That character is Rox D. Zebek. For now, the information we have portrays Rox D. Zebek as surprisingly a guy with good intentions at heart. We know that Rox wanted to dethrone the celestial dragons and become the king of the world, but we still don't have the full story of his motives. Even so, with what we already saw in the God Valley flashback, it's very clear that his crusade implied that the world government was evil, practically the enemy of humanity in his view. Just like Jonah, who saw the sinful city as something that had to be destroyed. There is a very revealing detail in God Valley, and it is that when Rox meets the king of Elbaf, who is in the holy land of Mary Joise, Rox's face shows surprise and annoyance, and he says something like, "A giant? The Holy Land? Is this guy lost, or what?" Rox knows that the celestial dragons enslaved giants, and seeing that giant there clearly makes him curious. This suggests that Rox had a sense of justice or compassion towards those who suffered under the celestial dragons. I might be reading too much into it, but take a look. Prince Loki of Elbaf idolizes Rox D. Zebek, and during the attack on Elbaf, when Loki faces the Holy Knights, he says to them, "I would never join scum like you." Considering that Loki himself has said his goal is to destroy the world, and yet he considers the celestial dragons much worse than him, I imagine that Loki, as a fanatic disciple of Rox, is repeating something Rox used to say. Loki hates the celestial dragons because Rox instilled that in him indirectly, and I think it's very significant that Loki worshipped Rox because the narrator in the manga reveals to us that Rox D. Zebek worshipped Davy Jones. Do you see? Loki idolizes Rox. Rox idolized Davy Jones. Davy Jones, according to real-world historians, is based on Jonah. Everything fits in layers. Rox wants to save the world by overthrowing the evil gods, the celestial dragons, but he also wants those evil ones to suffer their deserved fate, just like Jonah, who wanted to save the innocent but for the wicked to burn in hell. Rox, like Jonah, rebelled against the god of his time. In this case, he rebelled against Emu, the divine figure of the world government. Jonah fled from God and embarked with some unknown sailors. Rox fled to the seas and formed a crew full of powerful pirates who were not very loyal to him. When Jonah unleashed divine wrath, his sailors threw him overboard. The incident at God Valley and the arrival of Rox were caused by a betrayal from his own crew. In short, Rox D. Zebek is practically the Jonah of One Piece. And this would imply that Davy Jones, whom Rox revered, is also, in essence, a Jonah within the story of One Piece. Until now, we have associated Davy Jones with Jonah on the side of the legend and with Rox D. Zebek due to Rox's idolatry towards him. So I think we already have a solid basis for speculation. It seems very likely to me that the character of Davy Jones in One Piece has a personality and background inspired by Jonah, and that his story follows some of the patterns of Jonah's story, mixed with those of the Davy Jones story from Pirates of the Caribbean that we summarized earlier. But before going completely crazy, there is one last piece of the puzzle we have to mention: the Davy back fights. We already know that Davy Jones is somehow related to that strange pirate game introduced in the Foxy Saga, because it cannot be a coincidence that Rox D. Zebek, a worshipper of Davy Jones, formed his crew through Davy back fights. The narrator told us that Rox recruited members from other crews using that game. And what is the premise of a Davy back fight? Steal rival crew members and force them to join yours. It's a game of subjugation, basically. The winning captain takes the nakama from the loser. That sounds very similar to something we've already seen Emu can do, doesn't it? Think about how Emu can literally erase entire islands from the map or subjugate people at will as if they were pieces in a game. This theme of subjugating and taking what you want is present both in Emu's powers and in the Davy back fight. It cannot be a coincidence. Now let's connect the dots. In Pirates of the Caribbean, Davy Jones didn't start as the devil. Jonah wasn't the devil either. Of course not. They were ordinary people, or pirates who ended up in situations where the devil turned them to his cause. In One Piece, in the Foxy Saga, Sanji explains to us that pirates call Davy back the act of taking what you want from your enemies and, for example, snatching their crewmates. This game is named Davy, probably after Davy Jones. So what is the original background of a Davy back fight? Well, I'm gonna tell you what I suspect. I believe that the Davy back fights were originally created to recover Davy. In other words, I sense that in ancient times, someone lost Davy Jones, lost his soul to a devil, and created this game to try to recover him. I have a very strong hunch here. I suspect that someone, perhaps Emu or someone with Emu's power in the past, took Davy Jones's soul in a game or a bet. It could have been literally a betting duel against the devil. That's why the Davy backfights exist, to keep alive the possibility of reversing that outcome, to train and someday recover what was lost. As a curious note, there is an American song called The Devil Went Down to Georgia, which is about a musician challenging the devil to a fiddle duel. If you have never heard it, I recommend it because it quite well describes the idea of beating the devil at his own game, very much in line with what I think Oda might be doing with this legend. The image I have is the following: Davy Jones challenged the Devil of the Sea to a game, a competition, a bet, and he lost. He lost something more valuable than life. He lost his soul, and as a consequence, he was forced to join the Devil's crew. Imagine it, Davy Jones and his crew facing a demonic being in a sort of legendary Davy back fight, and Davy loses. And as punishment, he and perhaps part of his crew become enslaved by the devil. In the Legend of Pirates of the Caribbean, Davy Jones tore out his heart and kept it in a chest, thus distancing his soul from himself. In One Piece, it could be similar, but with a twist. Maybe it was the devil who tore out Davy Jones's soul and kept it somewhere, in Davy Jones's locker. In any case, the result is the same. The pirate Davy Jones ended up becoming the demon himself. Let's remember what Robin said, a pirate from long ago who was cursed by a demon, and what better curse than to become what you hated the most? It could be that Davy Jones was cursed, turning him into a demon under the control of the original devil. And we have even seen that with Zebek. The same thing happened in God Valley, that he was turned into a demon by Emu with the Domi Reversi. Even the small reference by Sanji in the Foxy Saga makes me think. Sanji says that taking what you want from your enemies, pirates call it Davy back fight, and at the end of the Foxy Saga, they say that whoever breaks the rules of that game goes to Davy Jones's locker, meaning they lose their pirate soul. It all sounds like the game is very tied to Davy's story, and what would happen after Davy lost his soul? Well, I imagine that his crewmates, or the people who cared about him, wanted to recover it. The only way to recover your lost comrade was to play against the devil again and win. That's where the tradition of the Davy back fights would have come from. Pirates training and competing among themselves to one day be ready to challenge the devil again and recover Davy. Does it sound far-fetched? Well, think about how it fits in Pirates of the Caribbean. Davy Jones removes his heart, which is equivalent to losing the soul. He keeps it in the chest, his locker, or he himself becomes the devil of the sea. Well, in One Piece, the version would be that Davy Jones lost his soul in a game against the sea demon and ended up cursed as a demon. Davy Jones in One Piece probably challenged the sea devil to a game and lost, and as a consequence, he transformed into a demon, becoming just another pawn of the devil himself. Obviously, it's still an incomplete story because we're extrapolating a lot, but what a story! I hope this theory is entertaining for now and seems quite solid to you, at least as much as it does to me. At first, I asked myself the question, could Davy Jones actually have been Joy Boy? We know of two great legendary figures from the past, Joy Boy, the hero of the Void Century, and Davy Jones, this cursed pirate about whom we have some mentions, and it is logical to wonder if they could be the same. And so far, nothing I have said contradicts that possibility. It could be that Joy Boy and Davy Jones were the same person, but interpreted differently by history. But finally, in chapter 1164 of the One Piece manga, it has been revealed that they are two people, as Zebek tells Emu if they fear Davy D more. Jones or Joy Boy. I'm going to propose something even crazier for you to really have something to think about. So far, my hypotheses have been relatively logical as far as they go, but hold on, because now comes the truly outrageous part of the theory. Let's remember, in Pirates of the Caribbean, the story of Davy Jones is a tragic love story. Davy Jones made a pact with the woman he loved, Calypso, and ended up feeling betrayed by her. But watch out, in the movies, Calypso didn't actually betray him with bad intentions. She confesses to Davy that she still loved him, but her wild and untamed nature forced her to be free, not to be tied down waiting 10 years for him. Basically, Calypso could not stop being free because freedom was her essence. Davy Jones, blinded by pain, interpreted it as an unforgivable betrayal and demonized her in his mind. But in reality, it was not exactly like that. There are interesting parallels here with One Piece. We could compare Calypso, that goddess of untamable freedom, with the idea of the sun god, Nika, the embodiment of freedom itself, even with Luffy himself. Calypso had a nature that could not be chained. Something like absolute freedom ruled her life. And what does Luffy represent if not freedom? Calypso did not wait for Davy Jones because she could not betray herself. She could not stop being free. Davy Jones, in his pain, perceived her as an evil traitor, like the devil of the sea. But in reality, he simply did not understand her nature. In One Piece, I think we will see something similar. Davy Jones probably became enemies with someone he cared about a lot, a friend, a loved one, maybe even his own captain, because he felt that person failed or betrayed him. But it may be that Davy was wrong, that he didn't understand the higher reason behind his friend's action. Let's go back to Jonah. It is easy to imagine that Jonah felt betrayed by God. God wanted to save the wicked people that Jonah believed unworthy of salvation. Perhaps Jonah even thought, why is God asking me for something so absurd? Is he playing with the devil by putting me in the middle of his game? Jonah might have come to believe that God himself was deceiving him or putting him on the devil's side for no apparent reason. And then Jonah, confused and angry, betrayed God by disobeying and fleeing. I would like to think that something similar happened in the story of Davy Jones in One Piece. That Davy Jones ended up confronting someone he deeply cared for or respected because he felt that person betrayed him first. Davy Jones made an enemy of someone very important to him, someone almost divine in his life. It could have been his captain, his best friend, or even his beloved, because he felt that person had betrayed him, although in reality he was mistaken and did not understand the full picture. So I propose this. Was Davy Jones actually Joy Boy? Or maybe he was someone from the era of Joy Boy who ate the Hito Hito fruit model Nika, the sun god, and was basically a parallel to Luffy? Personally, I don't think so, because as we mentioned before, in chapter 1164, these people are talked about as two different people. Similarly, we know how Oda is, we know how One Piece is, and Oda might surprise us by saying that simply Davy D. Jones was the name and Joy Boy the nickname, since Joy Boy literally means a joyful boy, and Davy D. Jones is a name. Likewise, for now, I choose to believe they are two different people because this is practically confirmed. We have to be careful with our assumptions. We have always thought, ah yes, he was a great pirate from the past. Surely he was a great captain, but what if he wasn't? Davy Jones could well have been the first mate of a crew, a member, not the leader. Maybe Davy Jones was part of Joy Boy's crew, even his right-hand man, and not the captain himself. Imagine that Davy Jones received a divine order in a way, an order from his captain, who for him was like a godly figure, especially if that captain had the fruit of the sun god, Nika, who was practically a divine envoy. And Davy Jones refused to carry out that order. He fled, feeling betrayed or outraged by what he had been asked. In terms of analogy, Davy Jones would be Jonah, his captain, Joy Boy would be the god or the son of God, the champion of the divine will at that time. Joy Boy with the Nika fruit and his mission to free the world would be that sun god giving orders, sometimes, that no one understands. If everything I'm saying were true, that pirate in that context is literally participating in a game, a cosmic game of betting against the devil. You are fighting against the devil, and what you risk is your freedom or your soul, your dreams. Once you enter the game, you cannot back out without consequences, because even if you manage to escape with your life, if you abandon it, you would have lost the most important thing in your life, your dream, your goal, which in this world is equivalent to losing your soul. The character Zoro himself makes his point of view clear. He would rather die than give up on his dreams. In fact, Eiichiro Oda himself said that Luffy does not kill his enemies because in the world of One Piece, and for Luffy himself, it is considered worse to destroy a person's dreams than to end their life. And that is what Luffy does with his enemies. And I don't just say this metaphorically, it's explicitly in the rules of the Davy Back fights in One Piece. There are 3 articles that define the defeat in that game. Number 1, any crew member captured during the game can only be recovered by playing again. There is no rescue by brute force. It has to be in the game itself. Number 2, the captured must swear immediate loyalty to the winning captain. That is, your will now belongs to the enemy. And number 3, a stolen flag can never be raised again. Losing your flag is losing your identity as a crew, and they warn that those who do not obey these rules will end up in Davy Jones's locker as a wretch. Translated, the one who breaks the rules loses their pirate soul and becomes cursed. It's not that they die instantly or anything, but it's worse. They are a pariah whose existence no longer has honor or purpose. A tormented soul, metaphorically dead in life. It sounds like going to Davy Jones's locker is like condemning yourself to that purgatory we talked about. So what do I think happened to Davy Jones? That he didn't play by the rules. I think Davy Jones, after arguing with his captain Joy Boy, or whoever his divine friend was, left the crew in the middle of that game against the devil they had going on. He broke the most sacred rules of pirate camaraderie, and that's why he suffered a fate worse than death. And well, this would be the end of the video. I think we've reviewed and discussed all the most important things about Davy Jones, Joy Boy, the Void Century, and everything. And above all, I think we've done very well following the clues that Oda has left us. Likewise, as always, I want you to leave in the comments everything you think about this theory. If you have an idea, if you dismiss something, if there's something I haven't mentioned that you think I've overlooked and you want to leave it in the comments, leave it in the comments. Also, as always, you can debate among yourselves, because you always do, and you are very respectful, which I appreciate a lot. And tell you that if you like the video, you can leave a big like, subscribe to the channel,